Hi, scholars. We are looking at our African American Studies textbook, and we have actually moved into a new section in the textbook. So we are now in part 3. It's called Social Responsibility, Service Learning, and Activism. And the first chapter that we are looking at is on page 141, which is Africana Studies and Community Service using the Strength Model. And for today's lecture, we're going to look at chapter 11 and chapter 12, which is on page 157. Chapter 12 is Africana Studies and Civic Engagement. And this section of our textbook is an especially exciting one because it really ties together the learning that you are participating with here in the classroom with theory and knowledge and sometimes more abstract ideas. And now you are tying it back together with service to communities and specifically Black communities. And now our Black Studies course is actually very new. And so we do not have community service or service learning projects as part of the course. However, this part in the textbook, part 3, gives you an idea to see how that civic engagement can be connected with what you're learning. So the idea would be maybe in the future that the course and or the program expands. So like right now, we are currently trying to develop the new ethnic studies department, which will house Black studies and other ethnic studies classes. However, once the department is formulated, you can actually have breakdowns between the areas of emphases. So you could get a degree in Black studies or Africana studies and take all courses related to that. You could get a degree in Asian American studies or Asian Pacific Islander studies or oceanic studies. And likewise, you could get a degree in Latino studies, Chicano studies, and of course, Native American studies, Indigenous studies. And so all of these fields, these disciplines, take community service, civic engagement as big portions of the work that you do. It was embedded in the very foundation of the disciplines when they got started in what is now, the traditional academic spaces here in community colleges and universities. So let's start with chapter 11. Again, that's on page 141. So I think the introduction here is very powerful because it reminds you as the reader that, and actually I'll just read the first sentence. From the very beginning of formal Black studies, there has been a stated commitment to academic excellence, cultural knowledge, and social responsibility. In a discipline born out of protest, inside and outside of the academy, there has been recognition of the centrality of continued involvement with communities and educating students. And so you should remember that as well, because in one of the very first chapters we read, outside of the introduction, with Danny Glover's Memories from 1968, which was chapter 2, he talks about how important it was that the movement for Black studies involved the community. It wasn't separate from the community. And so in this chapter, the authors are reminding us of that connection, because the point of the fields of study in all ethnic studies fields of studies is empowerment. It's pride. It's creating a difference. And the authors highlight that again at the bottom of this intro paragraph, in which they say that it's meant to empower Black communities, while in turn, Black communities offer real life settings for students to apply classroom learning. And of course, the way you apply the classroom learning can vary, but they give you some examples here of volunteering, civic engagement, and of course, service learning projects. And so the entire chapter is based off of what is called the strength model. And it's very similar to maybe you might have heard the term asset-based community learning or strength-based community building. And they actually have a really good table with the acronym laid out on page 144. If you can see it here. And so it provides a really succinct summary of the solution focus for S, trajectory preview for T, resource development for R, exceptions analysis for E, notice positives for N, goal setting for G, tenacity review for T, and of course, human capacity development for the last H here. And I want to stress that the introduction / chapter 1 of this textbook, in which we talked about the different African symbols from Ghana, is mentioned again here, because if you look at the top of page 142, they mention the spirit of Sankofa, which is situated in the present and looks to the past to imagine a better future. So if you remember Sankofa, some of you chose that for your symbol. It is the bird looking back, but also sometimes depicted as a heart. And so that is being referenced here again with the strength model. And the key on the strength model is that it builds on collaboration. And you might even consider some of the group work that you are doing in the class building on a similar mentality of collaboration, of equal exchange, of each person in your group adding their own strengths to your discussion. And I do like that they explain how this model is about empowering and motivating students, and that it contradicts some of the maybe more Eurocentric approaches to helping people, in which outsiders come in and they take over and they say, I know what's best for this community. First, let me pathologize and say what the community is lacking. And then this is how I'm going to fix it. And you need to be more like me or my community. And that's often a very colonizing perspective of an outsider saying they know more than the original inhabitants of a community. And this strength model approach just disrupts and dismantles that. It's not about outsiders coming in with all the answers. It's about becoming part of the community and letting the community take lead and their voices being heard, and then you assisting in whatever way or forms of labor are needed. So we could go through, and they do give 2 examples before they go into the elaborations of the 8 principles. So the 2 examples are Harriet Tubman and Clara Luper, and that's discussed on page 145. And I do think that these historical examples hopefully can also make you consider contemporary examples and ways that positive achievements and advancements and ways of dismantling racist structures can occur by utilizing your strengths, right? So we could go through each principle, but it's a lot. And I'd rather not have the lecture be too long. I do want to mention that each principle, as already stated, there's a quick short reference guide on page 144 with the table. And then immediately following that table is each principle discussed in detail. So, like, for instance, principle 1 starts on page 145. This is solution focus. So they provide you the detailed description of what solution focus means. For example, students listen actively and with respect and empathy for people's challenges brought forth in their community projects. The next step is not for them in the role of helper to jump in and try to solve these challenges. A solution focused approach recognizes and values the perspectives and power of the people being served. So this is what I was talking about, in which if you are an outsider coming into a community to make a difference, you let the community themselves be the center, and you actively listen to what they have to say and what they have to share with their own knowledges and perspectives, and then you contribute to that. And so principle 1, solution focus, it goes into that detailed explanation, and then it gives you an illustration. The illustrations in each principle is an example of the principle in practice. So it gives you a story or a potential real life example of how you can utilize this strength model. So the illustration for number 1, in which it's solution focused, the person coming in is a young service learning student, and she listens to Mrs. Johnson and hears Mrs. Johnson's issues or problems. This is where Mrs. Johnson's perspective is from. And so Mrs. Johnson takes lead as one of the agents of resolving her new life now that her husband has passed away, right? So it wasn't about the student coming in and saying, here, I know what's best for you, Mrs. Johnson. Just listen to me and you're going to feel better. So I like that each principle gives you those two sides. You get the very detailed description analysis, and then you get an illustration of the principle in practice. And so I think you can just read through it. I think, it seems very self-explanatory. Some might resonate more with where you're at in your studies or your life than other principles. I did really like principle number 6, which is the G of strength, goal setting, because it talks about the self-determination of the people and the communities. And so that has been on the forefront of my mind, because here, when you're considering ethnic studies, it's not about locating ethnic studies and other disciplines housed under social sciences or the humanities or an English department. It's about ethnic studies having its own self-determination in its own department. And so I did like this principle goal number 6, or principle 6, goal setting. And some of the illustrations, most of them actually come with quotes from real life individuals. And so in this one, they talk about Madame C.J. Walker, and they have a good quote from her. So you get some really good tie-ins with names and people that you might be familiar with. So I will just advise you to read through that. And then if questions arise as you're reading through the 8 principles, just reach out via email. The final chapter we will talk about this week is chapter 12, Africana Studies and Civic Engagement. That starts on page 157. And I highlighted the key thesis or point of this chapter, and it's like right in the middle of 157. The chapter emphasizes the critical need to connect scholarship with community-based, hands-on action strategies, programs, and initiatives that enhance the positive development and transformation of Black lives and communities, while also eliminating barriers. The practice of shaping the relationship between theory and practice is paramount in articulating the roles that academic, intellectual, and cultural development play in reinforcing and supporting the application of knowledge to lived experiences of Black people. And so for this chapter, I want you to understand that, and in general, Black studies, Chicano studies, Latino studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, these fields of studies are about positive development, about transformation, about centering peoples. It's not about constantly looking at the shame or guilt, or I mean, of course, you analyze the struggles, but it's about transformation. It's about healing. It's about empowerment. It's about liberation. It's all these positive things that we can contribute to society. And it's about eliminating barriers. So recently I was reading a free write from a student, and they were discussing how they're biracial and look very white, even though they're half Mexican, and how they feel guilty about the life that they've been able to lead so far. And I commented on it on the free write that it's not about feeling guilt, as if you need to feel shame or feel bad for having the life that you have. It's about everyone being able to have that kind of a life. It's about how do we knock down the barriers that prevent some communities and some groups from being able to experience that. And so how do we do that? It's less on an individual level and it's more on a systemic level. And so here, I really think it's important that it's building that relationship and that bridge between theory and between practice. Because it's one thing if we talk about racism and we talk about anti-Blackness, but then what do we do about it? Talking isn't enough. So how do we put the practice of what we are discussing into our lives and our future careers, right? And so this chapter, let's see, civic engagement is described at the bottom of page 158. So if you want to know what that means, it is the practice of carrying out duties associated with ensuring people's rights, human, civil, communal, municipal, legal, and political, and responsibilities as citizens. Students, faculty, community leaders, and service providers may become active collaborators in the Black community and beyond. So, civic engagement. Why is it easier for some groups to vote than others? How do we make voting rights equitable across all communities, right? So that is what civic engagement is about. It's not about, oh, you need to feel bad that you were able to vote. It's about everyone should be able to vote. Everyone should have that right and that choice. And the chapter has a really good layout of the types of civic engagement at the bottom of page 159. And they further talk a little bit about how being civically engaged involves really getting to know your community. And that's powerful because very much in a Western Eurocentric society, community experiences became very limited because land was stolen and taken and staked off and fenced off. And you have individual families that put up their walls and want their privacy and actually don't end up knowing the neighbors or the people that were living there prior to them, right? It's about othering and refusing to get to know someone else. And so how do we change that mentality in our neighborhoods and in our communities? As you're continuing on in this chapter, they give you kind of like a case study on an example of how you can take a theory idea from Black studies and apply it to an actual civic involved collaboration or community experience. So the theoretical portion that they discuss starts on page 160 with African-centered womanism. And they describe that at the bottom of 160, and then they continue to describe just plain womanism on page 161. Africana womanism. There is a really good textbook on it. There's a footnote 4, so you can find out more information about that book. But the theory, the framework, is a theoretical, family-centered, and community-oriented approach to self-name and self-define and establish unifying African cultural identity. It's an ideology created and designed for all women of African descent. And it is grounded in African culture, and it focuses on unique experiences, struggles, and desires of Africana women. So it's a really powerful description and analysis of this theory. And in other fields of study, there are similar, or you could say parallel, visions of feminist studies or third world women's studies or decolonial studies. And these are the high theory terms that people will talk about. And it's often talked about in academic classrooms and academic scholars. But now how do you connect it to lived experiences? How do you connect it to real life situations in our communities? And that is where the chapter kind of ends with, is 2 examples really. So the Africana course development for civic engagement, they talk about 2 courses at Michigan State University that utilize this African-centered womanism approach and the development of these classes that students can take. And that's discussed on page 163. And then they also talk about a conference for girls and young Black women. And this is on page 165, the Grit, Glam, and Guts statewide conference, again in Michigan, for girls and young women ages 12 to 17. And so there is the application of womanism to these very concrete and real empowering situations for young people. And I do also want to point out that on page 163 at the bottom, they talk about the methods that are pulled from Africana womanism as part of the work that is done in the classrooms, those civic engagement courses on health and wellness that are talked about at Michigan State. And so some of the pedagogical tools include culturally relevant teaching, autobiography, reconciliation and recovery, and incorporated African-centered womanism approaches. It's about empowering students to share their cultural history and heritage, validating and affirming their experiences, and transforming teaching and learning through practices of authenticity, transparency, and dialogue. And then they talk about holistic approaches to learning and to life and to wellness. And so it's just a really beautiful powerful example of how theory and practice merge and then come together to create stronger bridges and ways of thinking and knowing for young people that are out there making a difference in our world. And really all people, it's not, relegated to a small youth, because anyone who enters these spaces, no matter what your age is, has that power to transform. And especially if you come into the spaces with an open mind to expand maybe where education failed you or where education might have limited you. And I know for many of you, you've never taken a Black Studies course. This is the first experience you've had ever within ethnic studies or within Black studies. And that in and of itself is a shift into a transformative space, and it's a big movement. And I'm just so excited and proud and happy that I get to be part of that journey with you all as you experience something that's completely new. So I think we will end it there because this lecture is getting really long. If you have questions, please reach out via email. And yes, I really look forward to some of your comments about civic engagement and community learning.